The new theater of the mind. The Bruce Collins Show.
Welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show. We're very glad to have you join us. Tonight we'll be talking to one of the hottest Christian nonfiction authors of the day, Zachary Bartels, the author of Thomas Nelson Publishing's Playing Saint, as well as the latest book HarperCollins published, The Last Con. Again, we're going to be speaking with Zachary Bartels. The Bruce Collins Show airs every Friday night at midnight right here at WWPR 1490 AM. You can listen to past archives of the Bruce Collins Show at ipbn-fm.com. That's ipbn-fm.com. Go to the link that says shows, and you'll find the Bruce Collins Show there, and you'll go right to our page. We would appreciate it if you're able to spread the word for our show by word of mouth, social media, or in whatever creative way you can. Also, we have a Facebook page for the Bruce Collins Show. Please like us there. And you can email the show at bruce_collins_show@AOL.com. The Bruce Collins Show also has a YouTube channel. Visit YouTube, search for the Bruce Collins Show channel, subscribe, and catch all the latest shows on YouTube. And now, we're going to take a look into the literary world of Zachary Bartels. Coming up in a moment. Called the suspense author everyone is talking about by Family Fiction Edge magazine, Zachary Bartels is the author of critically acclaimed supernatural thrillers. An award-winning preacher and Bible teacher, Zachary has been serving as pastor of Judson Baptist Church in Lansing, Michigan for over 10 years. He enjoys film, fine cigars, stimulating conversation, gourmet coffee, reading, writing, and cycling. His debut novel, Playing Saint, has been called an intrigue-filled thriller by Library Journal and a page-turner from the very beginning, gripping and realistic by RT Book Reviews. His newest book, The Last Con by HarperCollins, has met early positive reviews. He lives in the capital city of a mitten-shaped Midwestern state with his wife, Erin, and their son. Zachary Bartels, welcome back to the Bruce Collins Show.
Thank you for having me on, Bruce.
Well, it's great to have you back. Now, I enjoy your books. I have both of your books, Playing Saint and The Last Con, and these can be ordered through Amazon as hard copy, and also if you have a Kindle reader, you can order these books. But great books. But for those who missed our first interview, can you go back and give us an overview of your first book, Playing Saint? What was this book about?
Playing Saint was about a kind of televangelist, shiny-toothed televangelist who his life got turned upside down when he got dragged into being a consultant on a murder investigation that involved the occult and all sorts of crazy things, and then the story kind of smashed into some Vatican agents and that kind of thing, and it turned out to be kind of an exploration of the nature of evil and several other theological themes, as well as kind of page-turner suspense novel, and kind of in keeping with a couple other books I've written. It's kind of the religious thriller, kind of pairing the clerical collar with the handgun kind of vibe.
Mm-hmm. Your books are action-packed, they're very creative, and you tell a great story. How do you come up with the topics and situations that you weave into these books?
Well, like you mentioned, I'm a pastor by day, so I just kind of write down my experiences, Whenever somebody that I'm counseling turns out to be a demon-possessed serial killer, I write down the details of that encounter and just kind of weave them in to the stories. I'm kidding. I haven't ever encountered most of the things I write about, at least not in as extreme of a case. I think that I tend to really start with the kernel of a historical event or a historical phenomenon or a group. I wrote a book a while ago called 42 Months Dry, where I started with a story, and then I took that into a modern world and started piling on car chases and gunfights and things. But with Playing Saint, it's the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, which was this kind of inquisitional group during the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, that it's still around today. With the Last Con, it started with the Knights of Malta. And I started, just doing some research on them. Then that led me to researching this guy whose name was Giuseppe Balsamo, or he presented himself as a Count Cagliostro. And I started to put together the idea that this guy was actually one of the first con men to ever use basically the same kind of con that was run in America in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And all of the elements of a grift or a con were there, and so I thought, how interesting would it be to kind of weave that historical element in with a modern day story of a con artist. And I've always loved movies and books about con men and heists and elaborate cons and things, Ocean's 11 and that sort of thing. So I just started kind of putting those things together, and if you have the writing bug, it doesn't take much to kind of start a chain reaction and things kind of fill themselves in.
That's a very interesting premise. Now, when you're writing, do you not start until you know the ending, or do you start writing and the ending sort of pops up?
Yeah, no, I don't start until I've got the whole thing. I don't put pen to paper until I've got the whole thing laid out. I was just on a panel at a bookstore, a book signing, with a guy named Stephen James, who's kind of the gold standard for Christian suspense. He's a New York Times bestseller. And when I mentioned that I outline, he flipped out on me in good fun. But he really he hated the idea. He said, "Well, what about the freedom for your characters to do these things?" And I said, I do exactly what you do. I just do it before I write things down. I'm more of a visual and an oral person, oral, A-U-R-A-L. I'm a preacher, and so I write most of my books by speaking them into a digital recorder and then going back later and typing them out. So I kind of have played the whole thing out in detail in my head. I had actually, for the Last Con, I had 3 big poster boards that were divided up into about 1-inch columns. And then I had put down little cards, colored cards, about 20,000 words of outline that I had put into an order. And I started with that. And of course it changes as you write. But yeah, I'm very nerdy about it. If someone were to just look at my writing space, they would probably assume I was planning some kind of elaborate assassination or something.
When you earlier mentioned that you had been counseling serial killers who were demonically possessed, I wanted to laugh, but I was thinking, I don't know where this is going, so I better keep my mouth shut.
I was on a radio show and I was promoting Playing Saint, where a guy started telling me that he had been possessed for 3 or 4 years, and that he was possessed by spirits that made him work out a whole bunch. This is a radio host, and I started laughing, and then he got real quiet, and it became clear that he was being very earnest with me. So yeah, I feel where you're coming from. You never know what people are going to be serious about.
The sad thing is, I've probably run into that person. I have, and unfortunately, I have 3 or 4 guesses, which I won't talk about right now. Now, about your books, one of the things that happens nowadays because of the internet, and the internet is awesome, but it has allowed a lot more of the arts to be performed in different ways. For instance, we have AM radio, which this interview is going to play on AM radio. But you also have podcasts. Many people are doing podcasts. They're doing streaming audio on the internet. They're posting shows to YouTube and various other venues online. The same is true with music and writing. You have self-published authors. So there's probably a lot of aspiring authors that want to get to the place that you're at. How did this happen for you? How did Thomas Nelson look at playing Saint, or how did you get it in front of their eyes, and then you became a mainstream author? How did this happen?
Well, what's beautiful about the thing you just described, the kind of changing marketplace of ideas and media, is that it's turned everything backwards, especially in the world of writing, where, 20 years ago, if you self-published a book, unless you sold, hundreds of thousands of copies, that actually was kind of a black mark against you when you tried to get a publishing deal. Mm-hmm. And so you didn't want to do that unless you were sure you never wanted to get a traditional publishing deal. Today, it's not at all a black mark against you. It's actually, it shows that you have initiative. It can show that you know how to build an audience and build a platform. So I actually did begin in doing indie books. And I teamed up with a guy named Ted Kluck, who's written, he has sold hundreds of thousands of books in a traditional setting. But just for fun, we started putting out these kind of little goofy satires, funny books. We put out a book called The Christian Gentleman's Smoking Companion about cigars and pipes. And then I put out an action novel, and I got the attention of some people with that book, even though it didn't really sell all that well. Mm-hmm. And then we in the process of doing this, I had been interviewed for a newspaper article by a woman who later became a literary agent, and I kind of leveraged that connection into her becoming my agent. And then she took the manuscript and brought it to HarperCollins, and they signed it. So actually, it was quite a quick process, and it's the kind of thing that people always warn aspiring writers not to expect this to happen this quickly. And then for me, it did. And I got a 2-book deal. So it was, I guess, luck for me, and also just kind of laying the groundwork with, I've got a podcast, Ted and I have a podcast we call the Gut Check Podcast. It's just fun, goofy stuff, but we build up our kind of tribe, and you put in the time to make sure there are people who want to read what you produce, and it can be a pretty painless transition from that to a traditional kind of situation.
There's an interesting path we can take that you just mentioned. You have a podcast, and I do want you to mention where people can listen to that in 1 second. But that is so true, because as you were talking, I was thinking about this. Traditional ways are gone. And so, for instance, this radio program, we're not just on AM radio, we're online, we stream online. People can listen to it there. They can listen to it at several different online platforms. When the show is over, we post it to even more web pages. I'm on Facebook, and years ago, my brother said, you should go on Facebook. And I said, why? And he said, well, there's all these great groups. You can talk to people. And I was thinking, it's a glorified chat room. And he said, no, you've got your radio show. You can promote that there. And I got to tell you, this radio show has increased in listeners because we have an online presence. We have a Twitter feed. We're active in social media. And that has gained for us listeners to this program. So for you, speaking of this podcast and your website, talk about those things, and then maybe turn that into a discussion of how important for you. For instance, I can't do anything without email. I email guests. I email literary agents. I do everything online. How essential is it for you to have a carbon footprint online? And then talk about the things you're doing through your website and your podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're describing what's become known as hybrid publishing through Barnes & Noble and all the traditional brick-and-mortar stores, and then combining that with the new media kind of indie aspects, like, just posting your podcast on iTunes and putting out books through CreateSpace or wherever, and more, even big names like Stephen King are doing some of this hybrid stuff. For example, I just this past week came out with a short story. It's 2 short stories together. It's called God Rest Ye Motor City, and it takes characters from Playing Saint and The Last Con, and it shows just kind of 2 more stories. One of them sort of a prequel, one of them sort of a sequel. They're standalone things, and I put them out, and I had them be free for 2 days. and just use them to kind of promote the book. So I put these things out through my own imprint, Gut Check Press, and then they're promoting what I've got out there with this, probably million or $billion empire, News Corp owns HarperCollins. So, the two work together rather than being two different options. You can bring them both together. I'm kind of mildly involved in almost every kind of social media. If you go on my website, which is predictably ZacharyBartels.com, along the side there's like all the little icons, Facebook, Twitter, all of them, even Pinterest, even though I'm a dude. But I'm not overly active in any of them except Facebook and Twitter, and I am probably too active in those. I'm constantly kind of posting things. And, I don't know if you struggle with this, but I'm always trying to find just the right balance between just pushing my content and promoting my stuff and actually interacting with people.
Yeah.
And I tend toward the latter too much. I think I don't push my stuff enough. I kind of just want to talk with people and joke about things and discuss current events. And then every once in a while I'm like, oh yeah, I also have books, which is kind of why I have this author page. So I don't know, but I do tend to try and use these new avenues to support the traditional publishing contracts that I have. And that's becoming more and more common. I'm part of a group of we're called the Suspense. I don't remember if we have a name. Suspense Writers Monthly or something, where we promote each other's stuff online. Mm-hmm. So when I have a sale on my book or have something new coming out, there's 4 New York Times best-selling authors who are tweeting about it. That's a way that we can all kind of support each other's stuff. I benefit more than they do because they're far more influential than I am. But we can, it's free. You just get out there. No one's buying full-page ads anywhere. No one's spending any money on it. We're spending 30 seconds at a time, and we're blasting out information, and everybody reaps the benefits. It's such a cool thing when you can figure out how to properly leverage it and not just get overwhelmed with the mass of the options that are available out there.
Now, as we said before, as we mentioned, you're a pastor. That in itself is a full-time job. So is there a certain time?
No, it's not.
Oh, it's not?
Pastors only work 20 minutes on Sundays. Haven't you heard?
My grandfather was a pastor, so I know that there's a lot that goes into it. And I wouldn't say it's a full-time job. I would say it's a full-time labor of love. I probably misspoke there earlier, but is there a certain time of the day you devote to writing, or do you have a certain routine when you're writing? In other words, does the words flow when you're playing music? Are there certain things you do when you write?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am a creature of habit to a fault. And what's been cool is that my wife is also a writer. She just got an agent, like a big-time agent, at a major agency in L.A., and she's well on the way to her first book deal. And she's well on her way to eclipsing me entirely. But what we do is we write together. So, after I've got a 7-year-old who just went to bed just now, and when he goes to bed, we often, if we're working on projects, we'll just start a fire and just write and write and write. If I'm trying to hit a deadline and I'm going to write, I'll do it in the afternoon, and I'll do it with a fine cigar between my teeth. Mm-hmm. And I have 2 or 3 different places that I go that, I have a device that was made in 2001, and it has no internet, it has no email or Facebook or any distractions. It's called a Alpha Smart, and it's just a word processor, black and white screen, and I will take that thing downtown. I have a particular bench I like to sit on, light up a cigar, and have a nice cup of coffee with me and just write and write and write and write. And I tend to get things done in several big, long marathon sessions rather than a little here, a little there like a lot of people do.
That actually may be a good tip for any writer considering all the problems with hacking nowadays. I don't know if any writers whose works have been stolen through hacking, into somebody's computer, but that's something interesting to think about. Maybe I'll write a book about it.
I think most writers are way too worried about someone stealing their content I've never heard of anyone stealing anyone's material. It's so hard to do anything with it once you've got it that I don't think anyone wants it.
Yeah.
Maybe the next Harry Potter people want to get a hold of before it comes out, but most of the time, I've had people tell me I do a lot of coaching for writers, aspiring writers, and I speak at a lot of conferences and things, and I've had a number of people say, I don't want to send this manuscript to someone until I'm sure they're going to represent me, because what if they take it and give it to a different writer and have them write it? Or what if I send it to a publisher and they reject it, but then the same book comes out, and it's just like the volume of manuscripts that are just pouring, just raining into publishers and agencies. The last thing that they're going to do is steal your work. But, who knows? You never know.
Yeah. What have you found personally for you to be the hardest thing about writing?
Starting for me is the hardest thing.
Uh-huh.
Once I get going, I will often neglect everything from like shaving to, feeding my dog to. Thankfully, I haven't yet neglected my congregation. But once I get going, it's pretty much 1,000 miles an hour. But it's hard to start. I had kind of a writer's block this past year where my agent was telling me, you should have turned in some proposals 6 months ago, because of course publishing is always a year or more behind, meaning if you get a book deal today, it's not coming out in 2016, it's coming out in 2017. And so I said, oh yeah, I'll get on that. And I for about 2 or 3 months just tried to get going, even just writing a proposal, which is about, I'd say 5,000 to 7,000 words, counting the sample chapters, and I just couldn't get going on it. And finally, I had to kind of bivouac myself in a cabin and say, I'm not leaving here until these things are done. And once I got going, it was no problem. But I find it the same thing with. I have horrible insomnia, but once I fall asleep, I'm out. Same thing with writing. Once I get started, there's no problem. It's just getting there.
Yeah.
Getting the momentum.
So you locked yourself in a cabin. Did your first page say something like, all work and no play makes Zach a dull boy?
I say a cabin, but it was probably closer to that ski lodge setting than the average cabin. It's bigger than my house. I have a very kind parishioner who has kind of told my wife and I, whenever you want, you can use the cabin. And we go there, and it's probably 3,000 square feet. It's a very, very nice setup.
So you said the hardest part for you is starting, and oftentimes you write after your son's gone to bed. So I imagine in those tough times, he gets to watch the evening news. No, I can find other things to do after he's gone to bed. There's always Netflix if I'm procrastinating. I thought you had to try to keep him up so you wouldn't have to write in those times. Now, do you think...
I've done that as well.
So, your writing style, is it evolving? Do you see that tangibly? And if so, in what way?
I don't know. I hope it's getting better. Mm-hmm. I had a funny thing the other day. Writers always tell you, don't ever read your reviews. Don't ever read people's, comments or ratings or anything. And I always read all of the reviews that happen across my screen. And this guy, a couple of, I'd say about a month or a month and a half ago, right after Last Con came out, he reviewed it, and he said, man, I read this guy's first thing, Playing Saint, and it was all right, but I wasn't all that impressed with it. And this one seems like a whole different writer. It was just amazing. And I thought I read this guy's review of Playing Saint. And so I went back and I found it, and he had written a glowing review of that one. So I thought, well, he saw some growth, I guess, to the point where it made it seem like the first book wasn't any good by comparison. I don't know. I tend to struggle with using the same sort of pet phrases and some of the same sort of descriptive things. I'm very much a status quo kind of guy, which probably makes sense. Since I'm a Baptist preacher, and Baptists are historically change-ophobic. I'm hoping I'm developing as I go. I don't know. I've been preaching now for nearly 20 years, mm-hmm. and I think that I'm kind of steady and doing that the same way, but if I occasionally hear sermons that I preached 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I think, oh man, that's bad. So it's probably one of those things where you see in hindsight that you've made progress, but in the moment, I don't know, I feel like I don't think I'm perfect and I've arrived or anything, but I can't point to where I'm changing and growing and evolving.
Now, some of us, and like yourself in your writing, we take risks, right, when we do our thing. And there are actors that won't go see themselves on the big screen. And I know for myself, only in recent years I've gotten used to re-listening to my broadcast, but for a long time, I was very hesitant about listening to past archives of the show. What about you? Reading your work, is that comfortable or not?
Yeah, for the most part. You know, when you go back and edit your work and revise, I often will find that the passages I thought were most magical and perfect and flawless seem just horrible when I revisit them. But once something's been worked over, it's gone through, you know, the editorial process. The publisher has gone through it with me. You know, a proofreader's gone through and taken all the typos out. I write the kind of stuff that I want to read. I don't try to write based on what's popular now. I don't try to write, you know, based on what's going to be best received. I just write what I would want to read. Mm-hmm. And so, honestly, this might sound horrible, but I love picking up a book that I've finished and reading it because I very specifically, it's like it was tailor-made for me because I write what I want to read. So, right. I don't have any qualms. I'm not squeamish about reading my own stuff. I've done a number of readings of my material, and I've usually been told at the end that I probably have read too much. But yeah, I don't have any issue with going back and revisiting my own voice. And you know, probably the same reason that you listen to yourself now is to see if you're developing verbal tics or there's something you can improve. Every week I listen to myself preach after the fact when I'm putting my MP3s up, and it's helpful just to keep going back and making sure you're not falling into some lazy patterns. It's the same thing with writing. Elmore Leonard used to tell people to do that. Go back and read and read and read. Read a lot of what you write. Make sure that you're not getting lazy and resting on, you know, figuring out what you can do is resting on it.
I personally try not to listen to other broadcasters because, particularly ones on the internet, because of all of the gaffes that go on in those broadcasts. So I try to focus on what I'm doing. How about you as a writer? Do you find yourself not reading other books because you may take from them, or do you find yourself reading other books to be inspired by them?
I have a very small stable of people I like to read. Mm-hmm. You know, there's often the advice, you have to read voraciously in your genre if you want to be a decent author. I don't have time. I read tons for my vocation as a minister. Yeah. When it comes to recreational reading fiction, I have just a small group of people that I read, and I read them. I don't think I'm going to steal their riffs by any stretch, but there are certain people, for example, Elmore Leonard, who I'll read and just really want to write something outstanding after I read it. Or actually, I have television that I tend to sometimes watch too in order to get inspired, like Breaking Bad or something like that. That's just really well written, you know, really good character development that makes me think, man, I feel like trying to do something that creative and that well executed.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, we touched on your first book earlier in this interview. Let's go to your book that's out now, new book, The Last Con. The publisher is HarperCollins, and this is huge, and it's a great book. I've been reading this book on my Amazon Kindle. Can you tell us about the premise of your new book, Zachary, The Last Con?
Yeah, it's about a guy named Fletcher Doyle who gets out of prison. He's been in prison for several years where he had been arrested for a heist that he was part of because he's a con man and a thief. And he got into that. He fell kind of backwards into that. He had been trained in world religion and history and philosophy of religion, and started using that to steal objects of religious importance. and he gets out of prison. He's trying to get it all back together, and so he's got a small daughter that he doesn't really know that well, who's 12. His wife and he are estranged, and he starts getting involved in his church, and he goes on a missions trip to inner city Detroit, and once he arrives, he runs into his old partner, he gets roped back into the old life, and they start kind of blackmailing him and forcing him to do these jobs. And it's basically just one kind of heist or con after another, kind of building up to a fever pitch to, at the end, he realizes that this has all been about attaining this one very, priceless artifact, relic, really. And so it's kind of one of these books where the stakes just go up and up and up. And it's all about a team of con men, some of them hesitantly or reluctantly involved, and some of them very much driven to get this item. And it flashes back and forth as well between 18th century France and modern-day Detroit, and you start to slowly realize what the connection is as the story goes along.
So I take it you're a history buff. So do you think that's what maybe makes this story special? Is The Last Con? Is there's elements of it that are nonfiction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, most of the history in it is nonfiction, and the historical elements bleed into the present day. I mean, the Knights of Malta, they have their origins in the Crusades, but they're around now, and so there are people who are part of this. It's often considered kind of a secret society where up until very recently everyone had to prove noble blood, and they're considered a nation. The leader is a bishop in the Catholic Church, and yet they're high up in governments around the world. They're high up in militaries around the world, and their allegiance is to the head of the Knights of Malta, and they have sovereign observer status at the UN. It's really fascinating stuff. Everybody's been writing about the Templars. They came and went relatively quickly, and when they went, guess who got all of their wealth? The Knights of Malta. These people that actually kind of were victorious throughout much of their history, rather than being a blip on the radar. Nobody's made much of them yet. So I thought it was high time somebody wrote a story where they were sort of the shadowy group, and you're not sure, even nearly to the end of the book, whether they're the good guys or the bad guys.
Yeah, and as a point of disclosure, I'm a member of the Knights of Malta, and that's why I couldn't tell you that I have a spirit that makes me exercise all the time. No, I'm just joking. No,
Wait, are you serious?
No, I'm not.
Checking, man.
Though, that's an interesting point. We were joking, but the last time you were on, I have interviewed over the years many conspiracy theorists. And, I take it with a grain of salt. I think there are conspiracies that go on, meaning I think there are people that do things in secret, and sometimes they work together to do those things, but I have no way of knowing what is and is not a conspiracy because I don't have that perspective. I can't go behind the curtain and say, oh, this is what's going on. But I know a lot of people have theories. So the first time I interviewed you, I know you weren't really a conspiracy theorist, and you kind of saw this as interesting, but you weren't really convinced that, there's a group that shapes and molds the future, the destiny of the things that are going on around us. Certainly from a Christian perspective, you believe there is the usual suspects conspiracy, which is the greatest trick the devil ever was able to do was to convince people he didn't exist. But from a man-made conspiracy, you were sort of skeptical, as I am. Now that you've written this book, where do you stand on conspiracies?
Well, one of the Illuminati kind of factors into The Last Con, and it's in keeping with the history of the group. There's been a couple groups by that name, but the Bavarian Illuminati is usually what people are talking about. Mm-hmm. The characters kind of parse through the fact that that came and very quickly went. Yeah. These things have been a flash in the pan. I mean, you get the best and brightest in America up to no good in Watergate. How long did they hold that conspiracy together before they start turning on each other? Like 2 days?
Right.
It's impossible to think that generations and generations and centuries can go by especially in this age when everything's being recorded and photographed and videotaped. I'm not saying that it's outside the bounds of reality.
Right.
I'm saying, how would people really know?
Right. Exactly.
How would the guys on the chat rooms? Where do they break into and get their information from behind that curtain and yet remain alive? That's my real question. Here's a real conspiracy theory for you, and this is one that I do hold to. If I were part of a vast conspiracy, the first thing I would do is start an internet chat room and talk about it, because that would immediately discredit the idea.
Yeah. And most of us would look at it skeptically anyways. And rightfully so. I mean, I think when you hear a new theory that is basically unfounded, you should look at it skeptically. But there is big business nowadays in conspiracy theory, so that
it's fun. I think it's fun stuff.
Yeah.
I do read about it, and I don't think that everyone who's into it is a nut by any stretch.
Right.
I know I have some folks at my church who like to talk about all these different groups that are meeting in their closed door things, and very powerful people, and
right.
and what are their goals. It's fun to speculate about because there's always been a very small minority of people who do shape history for the rest of us.
Yeah.
But to think that we can lay out an outline of what their plans are, again, there's a certain arrogance, I think, to that says, nobody knows this but me. How do I know it? Well, I saw it on a YouTube video.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I think what you just said about conspiracy theories in general lines up perfectly with how I feel about them. They're fascinating, but I have no way of proving them. So the Knights of Malta, for you, how much research did you have to do regarding this group?
Well, I actually researched it for about 9 months, and then my editor sent me an email and said, do you have a first draft for me? And I didn't write her back because I hadn't even started the first draft because I'd been so immersed in research. So it was a good 9 months of pretty solid, every time I had some spare time to devote to the project, and I'd already gotten the advance for the book. I was doing everything from watching these kind of wonky videos you get on Netflix that are available in DVD only, that are, made in somebody's garage, to reading dry academic histories of the Knights of St. John, which became the Knights Hospitallers and the Knights of Malta. And at some point I had to just say, okay, what I don't know, I will fill in with my imagination, and that's okay because it's fiction. So you get licensed to do that sort of thing.
In your book, The Last Con, the lead character is Fletcher Doyle. If he was sitting here with us, how would you introduce him? And do you think a writer needs to have a connection with his character for the writing to be effective?
Well, I think the writer has to be sympathetic to the character. This is what's freaking me out lately, Bruce. My wife is actually working on a novel from Hitler's point of view. Early young Hitler fighting in World War I, and she's reading these biographies, very thick biographies, and watching documentaries, and every once in a while she'll say, "Oh, it's just amazing what happened to him." At this case, I'll be like, "Yeah, but he's a monster, right?" Yeah, he's horrible, but you gotta, you always have to make sure that your reader, no matter how vile even your protagonist might be, and in Playing Saint, my protagonist was kind of a scumbag at the beginning of the book. Everything was about him, even using the church to build himself up. You still have to make them likable. You have to understand what drives them. I don't know how I would introduce Fletcher. I guess it depends on where in his kind of story arc he was. But you do have to have a connection. The character can't just be the vehicle for you to push your point of view. It can't just be a way for you to tell an interesting story because you had a really clever and unique idea. It also has to be, there has to be something of you in there, even if it's a tiny little something that gives you immediate access to that character, and then you have to know every inch and every degree of their motivation. Why is it that they're doing this? Why did they make choice A instead of choice B? And it has to be consistent.
Yeah.
And I think some of the worst mistakes I've made in writing early on, when I just started writing, was in you want the story to go this direction, so you have the character do what is necessary for that to happen without really justifying that. And suddenly, I know we've all read books, watched films, whatever, where a character acts outside of their real characterization, and you go, wait a minute, why would they do that? And then you go, oh, I see, because you needed them to be in Denver for the next scene.
Right.
It's a tricky thing to balance story and character. But I do try to keep kind of that character in my mind throughout the day when I'm writing, and kind of think how would Fletcher deal with this situation or that, or how would Parker Saint or how would Cagliostro, this con man from the 18th century, use this situation to his advantage, and kind of just, it's almost like working out. You flex those muscles in your mind associated with that character until you can get in that person's head instantly.
It's interesting the words you're using, because you're saying you have to understand the character, and there has to be a connection there, because no matter what artwork it is, whether it's acting, I've interviewed actors and they say the same thing. You have to understand the character. There has to be a connection there, and there has to be in that character almost like a part of you has to be in that character, and that character has to be part of you, if that makes sense. In other words, when you see Steve McQueen playing an American soldier in The Great Escape, that's Steve McQueen, even though he's playing an actor. There has to be a certain amount of genuineness to who he is. It's always him playing that character, in other words. So when that character feels grief, it's Steve McQueen feeling grief, and usually it's playing on something that has happened to him in his past. So it's a weird symmetry there. It's like it's Steve McQueen, but it's Steve McQueen playing a character, but there has to be Steve McQueen in it for it to reek of authenticity. So
right, yeah. And on the literary tip, then you can read 10 books by one author and you hear that person's unique voice.
Yeah.
But in each one, you better hear the unique voice associated with that whoever the protagonist is. Even if it's not first person, there's got to be a consistency to the voice of how that person's world is presented. And so it's both you and this imaginary person, or maybe a real person.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, and I don't think this was totally I think I raised this point with you the last time, and I was talking about some of the cheesy Christian movies that have been out, and I think some of those movies are getting better, and not all of them, or maybe not most of them, but you were talking about how there are a lot of great Christian books out there that are doing a good job. I see in your writing you like to write about imperfect people, don't you? Is that on purpose? Yeah,
I think that's the only way to really have an interesting or gripping story. Nobody wants to read about beyond maybe comic books. Nobody, and I'm a comic book fan, so no judgment. But I mean, nobody wants to read about someone who's completely they're all put together.
Right.
They're invincible. They're not going to compromise any of their principles. I mean, there's no danger to that. There's nothing exciting about that, even if they're put in a difficult situation. That's why you have Superman, and what he's doing in the first 2 or 3 appearances, he's just putting bad guys away, and it's no problem at all. Then immediately that gets boring, and we have to create people that are strong enough that Superman then is in danger of dying. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true of people's, their heart. If somebody's motives are always pure, somebody never struggles, somebody never makes bad decisions that sabotage their life or put people they love in jeopardy in different ways, then you have to get in there and create, the supervillains that'll make them the situations that are so difficult. There's no easy way out. I think flawed people are the best characters. My book that I wrote about the prophet Elijah, modernizing that story. The reason I picked Elijah and not someone a little bit less kind of out there is because he was just such a mess. He was so damaged. he seems to have been struggling with something like maybe bipolar or something, but without ever having the benefit of that being diagnosed because of where and when he lived, and having all the self-doubt, and probably, he killed hundreds of people in the story of the prophets on Mount Carmel, so he probably had PTSD. He probably, you think about all the stuff someone is struggling with, and then piling more on top of them. That makes for interesting reading. And you don't have to have bullets flying to do that. People have done that with, very tame, outwardly tame stories about internal conflicts. But unless you have somebody who is just about at the breaking point, and they've proven before that they can break, they can compromise, they can let it all fall apart, well, then there's no tension in that story. And that's the kind of thing I easily put down and forget and move on to something else.
And therein lies that connection. I think as a reader, we can relate to that. We can relate to imperfect people. We can connect with that. We can understand that. What do you hope readers will take away from your book, The Last Con?
Well, there's, first and foremost, I hope that they just take away a sense of having read an exciting and gripping book. I try, even though I'm a preacher, I try not to let what I write be just an excuse for a sermon, a thinly veiled spiritual lesson or something, some kind of allegory. So that's my primary goal is for people to be able to read it and go, wow, that was exciting. It made me think. It gave me a few moments of scare and made me laugh a lot. But beyond that, I think that there's a theme of identity in this book to make people think about who they really are. There's a back and forth in this character's mind about, am I the con man, the grifter, the thief who got caught and thrown in prison? Is that the real me? Or am I, a born-again guy? He has like a religious Jesus experience that so many people have in jail. And then when he uses that to get paroled, and then he gets out and he thinks, was I just playing a con on these people? Is that real? Is that really who I am? Or is this just something I've used? Is this just another way that I worked a mark? And I think it should challenge people, whatever their background or beliefs, to stop and think, which me is the real me? And a lot of us, I think, have different personas that we project depending on the situation we're in and the people we're with. And people are complex, but at the end of the day, I think we all want to be able to say, I know who I really am, and I can count on myself to not, to be faithful to that person, to that me, to that self. And so that's kind of what I hope people will struggle with and think about. And particularly from a Christian pastoral standpoint, I hope that people who are believers will be kind of encouraged that even when they screw up and drop the ball and they start to think they're living a lie, that they'll remember there's always grace and there's always another chance and God loves you anyway.
Yeah. And again, we're speaking with Zachary Bartels. He's the author of the book Playing Saint, and his latest book is The Last Con. I highly recommend both of these books, Playing Saint and The Last Con. Now, when you're writing a story and you've got all these characteristics going on with this character and you're connecting to it, I have to believe in your mind you see a picture of this character. So if The Last Con was turned into a movie, who can you see playing your lead character?
I would like Erin Paul, who has been in television and movies more and more lately, to play Fletcher Doyle. Mm-hmm. He's kind of who I saw in my mind at first when I started writing that book, and then interestingly, if I would picture him later, he kind of morphed and changed a little bit until he was someone I've never actually seen. I think as the character developed in my mind, kind of he changed from that initial image. But Aaron Paul, who plays Joshua on that horrendous Moses Exodus movie they made this past year, and he played the drug addict guy on Breaking Bad. Great actor. Mm-hmm. But of course, since it's a Christian book, if they made a movie, it would be Kirk Cameron.
Well, you never know. I mean, I recently just interviewed a guy named Brett Grandstaff, and he has decided to make faith-based movies, but he's also making secular movies. Their latest movie, Ridge Rock Entertainment, is Black Mass, which is the movie about Whitey Bulger. It's with Johnny Depp.
Yeah, that was spectacular.
At the same time, they're making a movie. They've already made it. It's going to be out in January. Ridge Rock Faith. He's the lead actor. It's called The Masked Saint. It's a wrestling-based movie. It's actually based on real-life events of a pro wrestler who was also a pastor, which is right up my alley because I used to promote professional wrestling. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I hope there are, and his whole purpose, as he stated in the interview with me, was I wanted to create a faith-based branch of my movie company because nobody was really putting in the quality into Christian movies. So we can only hope that's a good step. Now, speaking of good quality in books, you're the author, Zachary Bartels, of Playing Saint and The Last Con. And again, I hope people pick up copies of these books because they're exciting, they're real page turners. I really enjoy your work. Now, before you go, Zachary, where can people find you on the internet?
My webpage is zacharybartels.com. That's with a CH, like God intended, Zachary. And Bartels is Bartels. And from there, you can find my tentacles that go all throughout the internet. And my book, I know this is going to be archived and iTunes out and everything, but my book at the moment, The Last Con, is $2.99 for the ebook. All ebook platforms, Nook, Kindle, Kobo, all those. And I really encourage people to check out my short story collection, God Rest Ye Motor City, which is on Amazon right now as well.
Great. Zachary Bartels, I hope you can come back sometime. I always enjoy talking to you.
Likewise, man. Thanks again.
Thank you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Bruce Collins on location in the caves of Kilimanjaro. And so far, I see no signs of Bigfoot, only my little feet.
The new Theater of the Mind with the Baron of Broadcasting.
Thank you so much for joining us here at the Bruce Collins Show, where you can find us every Friday night at midnight here at WWPR 1490 AM. Remember, God loves you. We do too. Don't give up.